The Indian National Army (ZTH-INT-FD) was an armed force formed by Indian nationalists in 1942 in Southeast Asia during World War II. Its aim was to secure Indian independence from British rule. It formed an alliance with Imperial Japan in the latter's campaign in Southeast Asian theatre of World War II. The army was first formed in 1942 under Mohan Singh by Indian POWs of the British Indian Army captured by Japan in the Malayan Campaign and at Singapore. This first INA collapsed and was disbanded in December that year after differences between the INA leadership and the Japanese military over its role in Japan's war in Asia. It was revived under the leadership of Subhash Chandra Bose after his arrival in Southeast Asia in 1943. The army was declared to be the Army of Bosses Azi-Hukumati Azad Hind. Under Bose's leadership, the INA drew ex-prisoners and thousands of civilian volunteers from the Indian expatriate population in Malaya and Burma. This second INA fought along with the Imperial Japanese Army against the British and Commonwealth forces in the campaigns in Burma, in Imphal and at Kohima, and later against the successful Burma campaign of the Allies. After the INA's initial formation in 1942, there was concern in the British Indian Army that further Indian troops would defect. This led to a reporting ban and a propaganda campaign called GIFs, to preserve the loyalty of the sepoy. Historians like Peter W. Fay, who have written about the army, however, consider the INA not to have had significant influence on the war. The end of the war saw a large number of the troops repatriated to India, where some faced trials for treason. These trials became a galvanizing point in the Indian independence movement. The Bombay Mutiny in the Royal Indian Navy and other mutinies in 1946 are thought to have been caused by the nationalist feelings that were caused by the INA trials. Historians suggest that these events played a crucial role in hastening the end of British rule. A number of people associated with the INA during the war later went on to hold important roles in public life in India as well as in other countries in Southeast Asia, most notably Lakshmi Sehgal in India, and John Thivi and Janaki Athina Hapan in Malaya. The legacy of the INA is controversial. It was associated with Imperial Japan and the other Axis powers, and accusations were leveled against INA troops of being involved and complicit in Japanese war crimes. The INA's members were viewed as Axis collaborators by British soldiers and Indian POWs who did not join the army, but after the war they were seen as patriots by Indians. Although they were widely commemorated by the Indian National Congress in the immediate aftermath of Indian independence, members of the INA were denied the status of freedom fighter by the Government of India, unlike those in the Gandhian movement. Nevertheless, the army remained a popular and passionate topic in popular Indian culture and in Indian politics. First INA. Before the start of World War II, Japan and Southeast Asia were major refuges for exiled Indian nationalists. Meanwhile, Japan had sent intelligence missions, notably under Maj. Eiichi Fujiwara, into South Asia to gather support from the Malayan sultans, overseas Chinese, the Burmese resistance and the Indian independence movement. The Manami Kikan successfully recruited Burmese nationalists, while the Kikan was successful in establishing contacts with Indian nationalists in exile in Thailand and Malaya. At the outbreak of World War II in Southeast Asia, 70,000 Indian troops were stationed in Malaya. In Japan's spectacular Malayan campaign, a large number of Indian prisoners of war were captured, including nearly 45,000 after the fall of Singapore alone. The conditions of service within the British Indian Army and the social conditions in Malaya had led to dissension among these troops. From these prisoners, the first Indian National Army was formed under Mohan Singh. Singh was an officer in the British Indian Army who was captured early in the Malayan campaign. His nationalist sympathies found an ally in Fujiwara and he received considerable Japanese aid and support. Ethnic Indians in Southeast Asia also supported the cause of Indian independence and had formed local leagues in Malaya before the war. These came together with encouragement from Japan after the occupation, forming the Indian Independence League. Although there were a number of prominent local Indians working in the IIL, the overall leadership came to rest with Rash Behari Bose, an Indian revolutionary who had lived in self-exile in Japan since World War I. The League and INA leadership decided that the INA was to be subordinate to the IIL. A working council, composed of prominent members of the League and the INA leaders, was to decide on decisions to send the INA to war. The Indian leaders feared that they would appear to be Japanese puppets, so a decision was taken that the INA would go to battle only when the Indian National Congress called it to do so. Assurances of non-interference, later termed the Bidadari Resolutions, were demanded of Japan. These would have amounted to a treaty with an independent government. Japan did not immediately agree to these demands. Differences also existed between Rash Behari and the League, not least because Rash Behari had lived in Japan for considerable time and had a Japanese wife and a son in the Imperial Japanese Army. On the other hand, Mohan Singh expected military strategy and decisions to be autonomous decisions for the INA, independent of the League. In November and December 1942, concern about Japan's intentions towards the INA led to disagreement between the INA and the League on the one hand and the Japanese on the other. The INA leadership resigned along with that of the League. The unit was dissolved by Mohan Singh in December 1942, and he ordered the troops of the INA to return to POW camps. Singh expected to be shot. Between December 1942 and February 1943, Rash Behari struggled to hold the INA together. On 15 February 1943, the army itself was put under the command of Lt. Col. M.Z. Karani. A policy-forming body was formed with Lt. Col. J.R. Bonesla in charge and clearly placed under the authority of the IIL. Under Bonesla served Lt. Col. Shah Nawaz Khan as Chief of General Staff, Major P.K. Sahgal as Military Secretary, Major Habibur Rahman as Commandant of the Officers Training School and Lt. Col. A.C. Chatterjee as Head of Enlightenment and Culture. Second INA. Subhash Bose's suggestions that Subhash Chandra Bose was the ideal person to lead a rebel army into India came from the very beginning of F. Khan's work with captured Indian soldiers. Mohan Singh himself, soon after his first meeting with Fujiwara, had suggested that Bose was the right leader of a nationalist Indian army. A number of the officers and troops, including some who now returned to prisoner-of-war camps and some who had not volunteered in the first place, made it known that they would be willing to join the INA only if it was led by Subhash Bose. Bose was a hardline radical nationalist. He had joined the Gandhian movement after resigning from a prestigious post in the Indian civil service in 1922. Quickly rising in the Congress and being incarcerated repeatedly by the Raj. By late 1920s he and Nehru were considered the future leaders of the Congress. In the late 1920s, he was amongst the first Congress leaders to call for complete independence from Britain, rather than the previous Congress objective of India becoming a British dominion. In Bengal, he was repeatedly accused by Raj officials of working with the revolutionary movement. Under his leadership, the Congress youth group in Bengal was organized into a quasi-military organization called the Bengal Volunteers. Bose deplored Gandhi's pacifism. Gandhi disagreed with Bose's confrontations with the Raj. The Congress's working committee, including Nehru, was predominantly loyal to Gandhi. While openly disagreeing with Gandhi, Bose won the presidency of Indian National Congress twice in the 1930s. His second victory came despite opposition from Gandhi. He defeated Gandhi's favoured candidate, Boggaraju Patapi Sitaramaiah, in the popular vote. But the entire working committee resigned and refused to work with Bose. Bose resigned from the Congress presidency and founded his own faction, the All India Forward Bloc. At the start of World War II, Bose was placed under house arrest by the Raj. He escaped in disguise and made his way through Afghanistan and Central Asia. He came first to the Soviet Union and then to Germany, reaching Berlin on the 2nd of April 1941. The Japanese ambassador, Oshima Hiroshi, kept Tokyo informed of these developments. From the very start of the war, the Japanese intelligence services noted from speaking to captured Indian soldiers that Bose was held in extremely high regard as a nationalist and was considered by Indian soldiers to be the right person to be leading a rebel army. In a series of meetings between the INA leaders and the Japanese in 1943, it was decided to cede the leadership of the IIL and the INA to Bose. In January 1943, the Japanese invited Bose to lead the Indian nationalist movement in East Asia. He accepted and left Germany on the 8th of February. After a 3-month journey by submarine and a short stop in Singapore, he reached Tokyo on the 11th of May 1943. In Tokyo, he met Hideki Tojo, the Japanese Prime Minister, and the Japanese High Command. He then arrived in Singapore in July 1943, where he made a number of radio broadcasts to Indians in Southeast Asia exhorting them to join in the fight for India's independence. Revival on 4 July 1943, 2 days after reaching Singapore, Bose assumed the leadership of the IIL and the INA in a ceremony at Cathay Building. Bose's influence was notable. His appeal reinvigorated the INA, which had previously consisted mainly of prisoners of war. It also attracted Indian expatriates in South Asia. He famously proclaimed, "Local civilians joined the INA, doubling its strength." They included barristers, traders and plantation workers, as well as Kulabadi Sindhi Swaranka who were working as shopkeepers. Many had no military experience. Kulvadi Velabel estimates under Bose's dynamic appeal, membership of the IIL peaked at 350,000, while almost 100,000 local Indians in Southeast Asia volunteered to join the INA, with the army ultimately reaching a force of 50,000. Hugh Toy, a British intelligence officer and author of a 1959 history of the Army called The Springing Tiger, and American historian Peter Fay have reached similar estimates of troop strength. The first INA is considered to have comprised about 40,000 troops, of whom about 4,000 withdrew when it was disbanded in December 1942. The second INA started with 12,000 troops. Further recruitment of former Indian Army personnel added about 8,000–10,000. About 18,000 Indian civilians also enlisted during this time. Bell estimates almost 20,000 were local Malayan Indians, while another 20,000 were ex-British Indian Army members who volunteered for the INA. The exact organization of the INA and its precise troop strength is not known, since its records were destroyed by the withdrawing Azad Hind government before Rangoon was recaptured by Commonwealth forces in 1945. The order of battle described by Fay, nonetheless, is similar to that described of the first INA by Toy in The Springing Tiger. The 1st Division, under M.Z. Karani, drew a large number of ex-Indian Army prisoners of war who had joined Mohan Singh's first INA. It also drew prisoners of war who had not joined in 1942. It consisted of the 2nd Guerrilla Regiment consisting of 2 battalions under Col. Anayat Karani, the 3rd Guerrilla Regiment with 3 battalions under Col. Gulzar Singh, and the 4th Guerrilla Regiment commanded by the end of the war by Lt. Colonel Guru Baksh Singh de Hillan. The 1st Guerrilla Regiment, the Subhash Brigade, under Col. Shah Nawaz Khan, was an independent unit, consisting of 3 infantry battalions. A special operations group was also to be set up, called the Bahadur Group, to operate behind enemy lines. A training school for INA officers, led by Habibur Rahman, and the Azad School for the civilian volunteers were set up to provide training to the recruits. A youth wing of the INA, composed of 45 young Indians personally chosen by Bose and known as the Tokyo Boys, was also sent to Japan's Imperial Military Academy, where its members trained as fighter pilots. A separate all-female unit was also created under Lakshmi Sahgal. This unit was intended to have combat commitments. Named Jhansi Ki Rani Regiment, it drew female civilian volunteers from Malaya and Burma. The 1st Division was lightly armed. Each battalion was composed of 5 companies of infantry. The individual companies were armed with 6 anti-tank rifles, 6 Bren guns and 6 Vickers machine guns. Some NCOs carried hand grenades. Men going forward on duty were issued British stocks of hand grenades by senior officer of the Bahadur groups attached to each unit. Mortars were available, but Fay points out these were not available at battalion level. The 2nd Division was organised under Colonel Abdulaziz Tajik. It was formed largely after the Imphal offensive had started and drew large remnants of what remained of the Hindustan Field Force of the 1st INA. The 2nd Division consisted of the 1st Infantry Regiment, which later merged with the 5th Guerrilla Regiment to form the INA's 2nd Infantry Regiment under Colonel Prem Sahgal. The 1st Infantry Regiment drew a large number of civilian volunteers from Burma and Malaya and was equipped with largest share of the heavy armament that the INA possessed. An additional 3rd Division of the INA was composed chiefly of local volunteers in Malaya and Singapore. This unit disbanded before Japan surrendered. A motor transport division was also created, but it was severely limited by lack of resources. In 1945, at the end of the INA, it consisted of about 40,000 soldiers. Unlike Mohan Singh, whose assumption of the rank of general had generated opposition, Bose refused to take a rank. Both the soldiers of the INA and civilians addressed Bose as Netaji. In October 1943, Bose proclaimed the formation of the Arzi Hukumat-e-Azad Hind, or the Provisional Government of Free India. The INA was declared to be the Army of Azad Hind.